Hey guys, it's Caitlin Slaughter, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Phyllis Whitley and how she pertained to our class. First of all, she was born in West Africa in 1953, what is now known as modern-day Gambia. In 1761, she was actually captured and transported to America in a slave ship actually called Phyllis. When she arrived in America on July 11th, 1961. She was sold to a prominent Boston commercialist named John Whitley um, as a maid for his wife Susanna. She was baptized and named after the ship that she rode over to America on, and she also at that same time, she also changed her last name to her master's last name out of respect. And she began showing interest in books and studying and different things like that, literature. And Susanna and Mary Wheatley actually took her under their wing, and they actually began to teach her how to read and write. And in 1967, she actually published her very first poem, and I'm going to butcher the name a little. It's called On Messrs. Hussey and Coffin in the Newport Mercury. She had wrote many poems to famous people to thank them for the things that they did in the community and things such as that, such as the poem To the King's Most Excellent Majesty, and it was praising King George III for repealing the Stamp Act. She was also mesmerized by the Bible, and she read the whole thing through in a little over a year within the time she had arrived to America. She wrote many poems about religion, and she became well known for her poetry after her tribute to George Whitefield. And George Whitefield he was actually a popular evangelist who was the chaplain of Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntington, who was to become Phyllis's patron. And the poem was called An Elegiac Poem on the Death of that Celebrated Divine and Eminent Servant of Jesus Christ, the Reverend and Learned Mr. George Whitefield. She became really well known after that. It became a big thing just because he was a popular evangelist, and pretty much everybody in the community and the surrounding communities actually knew who he was. And in 1770, Phyllis she had to go to court to defend her authorship of her poems because they didn't think that a slave could write as well as she did. And there were 17 men in Boston, including John Hancock, John Irvin, Thomas Hutchinson, and Andrew Oliver, who wrote an attestation that Phyllis Wheatley was the author of her work. And after that, it was proven that she was the author of her work, and she was the one writing the poems. And it was just hard for people to believe because back in that time, slaves were not. It was very rare if a slave was well educated and knew how to write and speak English, and especially as well as she did. So, Phyllis actually traveled to London to publish her very first book. And the book was called Poems on Various Subjects, Religions, and Moral. And it was one of the first books that a woman had ever written, and actually became, it actually helped people know her better. Also, in 1775, she also wrote a poem to George Washington, and it was called To His Excellency George Washington. And in 1776, George Washington had invited Phyllis, which was very rare because slaves were never invited to people's homes or anything like that. he actually invited Phyllis into his home for a private reading of her poem and to thank her for the poem that she had written for him. And she finally gained her freedom from slavery in 1778 when her master John Wheatley died. And after that, she soon married John Peters, who was not too long after that, he was incarcerated for the debt that he had accumulated. And before she had died, she wrote an elegy sacred to the memory of the great divine, the Reverend and the learned Dr. Samuel Cooper. She wrote the poem, like I said, not too long before she had passed. And after that, she began to work in a boarding house as a maid because she was living in poverty because her husband was in debt and they were trying to pay it off, I guess. And so she began to work as a maid in a boarding house to make more income. And they also had 3 children together, and they all died in infancy. And she also she passed away on December 5th of 1784 at the age of 31 due to health complications that she had had all throughout her life. She was not a very healthy person, seeing as though she had rode over on a slavery ship, and they were not very hygienic ships, and there were diseases running rapid and things like that. And the way that she pertains to our class is we talk about poems and the early American literature in this class, and some of her poems were actually mentioned in our book in the section that we had to study on poem. So that's how she pertains to our class. So thank y'all for spending y'all's time listening. Hope y'all have a great day. Thanks.